So I founded the Institute for the Gender in the Economy this past year because we're in a situation in our economy in which not everyone gets the opportunity to participate fully and to realize their potential. And by not everyone, what I mean in this case is 50% of our society that are the women in our economy. And it seems only fair that women should be represented at every echelon of the economy, from entrepreneurship to corporate leadership to policy making. And yet it is not the case. And in fact, it's an incredible challenge that we have not been able to overcome the barriers to this kind of participation, despite many efforts on the parts of many organizations and policymakers and the like. And the basis of the Institute for Gender in the Economy has been to bring rigorous research into this conversation to figure out how we can make progress and maybe even change the conversation that we're having. That being said, I think in addition to the everyone should be able to participate and have a role, there's also a strong business imperative for figuring out how to make gender equality work. And when I wrote the chapter for this book, Survive and Thrive, that we're launching today, I was thinking about the kinds of reputational risk and costs associated with things like, in this example, Walmart's class action suit, that they had been fighting a series of class action suits brought by women over the last nearly 20 years. The first starting out with 1.4 million women suing the company because of lack of opportunity in the organization. And while none of those lawsuits have exactly been successful over these years, it has been very costly from a reputational standpoint for Walmart and from a standpoint of just all of the legal costs associated with these lawsuits. And this seems like a big enough imperative to even be thinking about why you should be paying attention to gender equality in organizations. If we think more recently what's been going on, for example, Susan Fowler's recent viral blog post about the sexual harassment that she experienced at Uber, and not only that she experienced the sexual harassment, but that she was not protected at all by the organization and the perpetrators were not punished in any way. This led ultimately to tremendous upheaval in the organization, including the resignation of the CEO and big efforts to change in corporate governance. So this ends up being highly costly to the organization. This is one way to think about the kinds of existential threats that can be created by a lack of attention or lack of investment in gender equality. But another way to think about this challenge would be in terms of the war for talent. And if you look at this quote, it says, if you exclude 50% of the talent pool, and I would say not just exclude, but also just undervalue the contributions of 50% of the talent pool, it's no wonder you find yourself in a war for talent. And in this day and age, with the rapidly changing economy, with digitization, with globalization, and all these things, the war for talent is real. But the other thing I should mention about this quote is that this is from someone who's an executive director for the Washington State Investment Board. This is someone who's investing millions of dollars in pension money in companies. And what this person is saying is that we want the companies we invest in to pay attention to gender equality. And if they don't, we're actually going to move our investment dollars. So if companies want to have full access to the capital markets, they also have to think about gender equality. So these are some ways of thinking about the importance of the business imperative. And in fact, many companies have thought quite hard about this and have tried and made efforts. And yet what we know from those efforts is that, and we know this from research and we know this from the experience of just looking around at any organization in which we participate, that these efforts have not necessarily worked. And in fact, they have not only not worked, many of the efforts that organizations undertake, probably most famously implicit bias training, which probably many people here have participated in, often that can not only not work, but it can backfire in organizations. And we see this backlash happening throughout the economy, from Silicon Valley to corporate leadership, where recent surveys suggest that a sizable minority, maybe upwards of 40% of men in the corporate world, believe that we are spending too much time thinking about diversity and gender equality. And so we know that from the research, that the reason that these efforts haven't worked is in part because organizations have not invested in the full suite of activities that are really necessary beyond just training here or there in order to make progress. So what would that investment look like? I'll give you the example of Salesforce.com. This is an organization where the CEO made the decision that he was no longer going to tolerate the gender wage gap. We know that the gender wage gap exists in all sorts of places across the economy, depending upon which country you look at. It's upwards of 20 cents on the dollar, and if you look at women of color, it's even stronger. And what he said was, we want to close that wage gap. So they did the analysis, and they figured out that there were substantial wage gaps even within their company, and so he spent $3 million equalizing pays to make sure that men and women were paid equally. A year later, they go through the exercise again, and because of all the kinds of natural biases that creep into our processes for hiring, promotion, and evaluation, the gender wage gap had appeared again, and he spent another $3 million actually closing it. So this is what we mean by investment. What we mean is real money, real time, real effort in making this change. And I should note that that investment should also be thought of on a personal level. So this is a quote from Charles Blow in a recent op-ed that he did in the New York Times, and he said, if you are not actively working to dismantle it, and by it he means discrimination and gender inequality, you are supporting it. It is not sufficient to simply say to not be sexist yourself. Every man must become a feminist. He said every man must work as hard as every woman to elevate gender equality and to eliminate gendered violence. And so what he's saying is that we all have a role ourselves. People of all genders have their own role to play in terms of making their own personal investments in their time, in their political and social capital, in their resources in order to make this happen. So that's what I mean by investment. And so in the chapter in Survive and Thrive, I outline 4 different ways that we could think about what investment looks like at the personal and at the organizational level. And it starts with the idea of sponsoring and not just mentoring. So mentoring means giving advice. Sponsoring means exactly what I said about investment. Spending some of your political capital, your resources and time, not just a hashtag and a selfie on Instagram, but something much more to be able to help women get a foot in the door or a place on that supposedly equal playing field. So one is actually to sponsor, and this can happen at an organizational and at an individual level. The second is to enroll and engage and to build support. We know, because backlash is happening, that not everyone does support this agenda, despite the business imperative, despite the social justice imperative. And so what can you do individually, and what can organizations do to bring everyone on board, to figure out what are the sources of the backlash, to help people understand the opportunities that can come from achieving gender equality and diversity in organizations. The third is to increase transparency. We know from experiences that we've seen when all sorts of companies, including the Salesforce.com example, that when you actually study the data and disclose it, data on hiring, data on pay, data on promotions, that you not only give individuals themselves the tools that they need to be able to promote themselves within organizations, but you also give organizations the tools they need to be able to make change because they really know what's going on. So transparency is incredibly important. Revealing the data is incredibly important. And then finally, and I would say most importantly, we have to talk about monitoring and holding people accountable. That this is often the missing link in all of these initiatives. We do something, but we then don't hold people accountable. One example of that would be something like in recruiting, where some companies have now implemented rules where they say, we will actually not let you make the hire if you cannot prove that you had a diverse slate, women, people of color, that you were considering for the job. And many organizations are implementing it. Some people have complained about these kinds of approaches, saying, well, this is really going to extend the time it takes to hire people. The economy is moving too fast. We don't have the time to waste. So a company like Pinterest, for example, has just done the research into how much extra time it has taken now that they have implemented this kind of rule in their own hiring practices. And what they found is that it takes on average about a week longer to make a hire when they make this effort to create diverse slates. Now, some people might say, a week is still too long, the economy is moving too fast, but what the people at Pinterest would say is, it's worth it to make sure we actually get the best and brightest, most qualified candidates in our work. And so that's what we mean when we say monitoring, holding people accountable, is actually putting resources into it or withholding resources if you're not achieving what you're trying to achieve. So that's, I think, investment is incredibly important, and we need to figure out how to do that inside organizations. But I also want to make a pitch for innovation. So I've spent my entire career doing research on innovation and working with companies on how to improve their innovativeness. And I really believe that if we can treat gender equality as an innovation challenge, we can make much greater progress on the problem. And I don't mean product innovation. I really am thinking more about process innovation, business model innovation, different ways of thinking about how we actually do our business. So for example, we know that in the world of venture capital and startups, the way that most ventures get funded is they make a pitch to a series of investors. We also know that pitching is a highly gendered activity that actually leads to disadvantages women entrepreneurs because the multiple expectations placed on women when they're actually asking for something in something like a pitch. So why can't we innovate in the due diligence process? Think of a different way of figuring out which are the ventures that are worth funding and supporting as we go forward. Another example. A lot of corporations, law firms, and the like do fit interviews for people when they're hiring to figure out if they were going to fit in the culture of this organization. Well, what we know about fit interviews is from the research, it shows that you end up hiring people who are just like you, which means that you are reducing your ability to increase the diversity of your organization, and we know diversity can contribute to creativity and innovation inside the organization. So why can't we innovate in the way that we do hiring to figure out how we can get the most talented people inside an organization, people who are really going to contribute and maybe get rid of the fit interview? As a third example, we have just launched a course called Designing for Equality here at the Rotman School, where we are using design thinking innovation principles to address gender-based challenges. And through this, we are actually coming up with new ways of conceptualizing the problems as well as innovative ways of thinking about solutions. So I really believe that if we can reconceptualize gender equality as innovation challenge, we can end up with the innovation economy we want, the workplace that we want, the corporations that we want, and the society that we want. Thank you very much.